The film industry has portrayed the Middle Ages as a time that was full of knights, castles, and great struggles of kings who aspired to have glory, power, and peace. However, history shows that this era was anything but civilized and peaceful. Every day, men clashed in bloody fights that left crushed bones, incurable wounds, and even atrocious deaths. The most curious thing is that most of these battles were part of the famous medieval tournaments, which were nothing more than great spectacles in which fights to the death were held. All kinds of chilling stories originated in these tournaments, and they were impressive enough to have transcended in time. To get to know their different modalities, today we will take you through 4 tournaments that marked an era full of blood and events that will make your blood run cold. Number 4. The Jousts. During the Middle Ages, wars were common and regular. The great lords were involved in hundreds of battles every year, and when this didn't happen, huge tournaments were held to continue perfecting the military skills of soldiers. According to records, this tradition began in the year 1100, when hundreds of knights gathered in France to fight in combats that had practically no rules and pushed their participants to use real weapons such as swords and spears. At that time, one of the knights' favorite forms of combat was jousting. The first jousts were held with huge, sharp-pointed spears and took place in the main fields of Europe. The competition consisted of dismounting the adversary, although the best way to do it was to kill them. Far from the jousting that movies have tried to recreate, these competitions forced their participants to dodge real weapons or try to annihilate the opponent. The first encounters left numerous murders, and such was the thirst for blood that the church banned these competitions in the year 1300. Over time, the weapons were replaced by spears without sharp points, and the rules were modified so that each thrust was associated with a score. This way, the jousts became less bloody, but it didn't prevent various murders from occurring on several locations. Nowadays, if one reviews the archives of the great European families from that era, one can easily discover that there isn't a single clan that didn't have a family member that was killed in the middle of one of these tournaments. The lives claimed by this competition can easily position it as one of the deadliest sports in the history of mankind, although this is something that movies will definitely never show you. Number 3. Foot combat. One of the most striking tournament modalities of the Middle Ages was called foot combat. As the name suggests, it consisted of a fierce battle with no other help than the contender's own skills. The first fights of this modality consisted of a pitched battle between several men who faced each other in all-against-all combat or in individual duels. Of course, most of these fights were to the death, and it took less than 10 minutes for these tournaments to turn into an absolute carnage. Indeed, their popularity spread throughout Europe, and as it happened with jousting, they left dozens wounded and a large number of fatal victims. However, despite the dangers and the high death toll, knights enlisted in droves. Most of the time, these men wore thick armor befitting their social class and economic status, though that did little to protect them when they had to face a man skilled with a sword, mace, or spear. The most amazing thing about these tournaments was their huge audience. Thousands of peasants, aristocrats, and knights would gather in a large field to witness a high-stakes sport. Many times, the fights would take place in a small circle in the middle of the field, into which 2 or more knights would enter, but only one would come out stained with the blood of his enemies. Number 2. Hybrid fights. If jousting or foot combats weren't sufficiently complex and bloody, a new tournament modality emerged during the Middle Ages, and it quickly became the greatest fascination of the plebs and the aristocrats due to its complexity, the spectacle it offered to the audience, and the blood it left in the fields of Europe. Its name was hybrid fights and consisted of mixing the best of jousting and foot combat in a great pitched battle. To do so, Two teams engaged in an atrocious fight that sought to emulate what ordinary soldiers experienced on the battlefield during wars. Usually, hybrid fights consisted of two equally brutal and violent phases. In the first phase, both teams faced each other with spears and mounted on horses. Several knights were usually killed by these lone weapons, and others died due to the violent fall when they were knocked off their horses. Those who survived quickly moved on to the second phase, the fight on foot. They immediately unseated their swords and launched powerful slashes that often tore the horses to pieces and, on other occasions, dismembered their adversaries. The battles were truly bloody, and those who participated in them quickly became corpses or legends. There was no middle ground. This is why they became one of the most savage traditions on record throughout the Middle Ages. Number 1. Gladiator fights. Usually when we talk about gladiators, we immediately associate them with the ancient Roman Empire, which is logical since the sport of blood and death became a tradition in the titanic colosseums of this culture. For more than a millennium, Romans enslaved the inhabitants of the lands they have involved, and all men who opposed their weapons were sent to the colosseums to fight for their lives, day after day. Of course, the battles were to the death. No one escaped the shouting and cheering of the plebs, and the arena of these huge battlefields was drenched in blood almost every day. However, although many people may presume that this tradition disappeared with the fall of the Roman Empire, the reality was different. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, the barbarian peoples occupying the ancient Roman lands also adopted the old customs that would later inspire the medieval tournaments. Back then, although there were no huge colosseums, prisoners of war were subjected to having the life of a gladiator and were forced to adopt a completely different name and life if they didn't want to die. But sooner or later, death came. The life of a gladiator wasn't very long. In ancient Rome, fighters were immersed in dramatic and legendary fights that allowed them to live 5 or 10 years more after being captured and subject to the slavery of the arenas, but only if they were lucky enough to avoid having a bloody death in a battlefield before that. In the Roman Colosseums, some gladiators were rewarded with freedom by the emperor or by the organizer of the fights. This happened very rarely. The same was done during the Middle Ages, but the life expectancy of prisoners was practically nil during this period. Men fought for their lives, but they always met their deaths, and their corpses ended up as food for scavengers and worms. Of course, these bloody traditions were part of the societies of the Western world as we know it. Some anthropologists and historians suggest that this thirst for death is still present in our culture, but has been replaced by sports and other activities. It certainly is an interesting idea, although it's not the only one that shows a bit of who we are as a society. In fact, if you want to continue learning about other bloody customs from a not-so-distant past, check out the following videos and get ready to discover facts you never thought were possible.